Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all. As a very first course of business, let me say a quick note on interpretation. We have English, Spanish, and French available today, and there is a globe icon, as mentioned, at the bottom of your screen to select your language. We suggest you mute the original audio for optimal hearing. So let's get started then. Thank you for being with us today. My name is Nadia Dar, and I will be moderating this press conference hosted by Oxfam on behalf of the Independent Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation, ICRICT. ICRICT is a group of leaders from around the world who believe that at this moment in history, there is both an urgent need and an unprecedented opportunity to bring about significant reform of the international corporate taxation system. ICRICT was initiated by and is supported by a coalition of civil society and labor organizations, including Oxfam. And we're thrilled to host this press conference today to launch ICRICT's new report titled The Global Pandemic, Sustainable Economic Recovery and International Taxation. The embargo on this report has now been lifted and is available for download on ICRICT's website. The unprecedented nature of this crisis is prompting a reflection on how and who will pay for the recovery. And with a dramatic gap in tax revenues, which have been falling, there is a sense of urgency now about whether new tax measures should be contemplated and how to ensure these alternatives are fair and equitable. That's what we'll be talking about today. Before we get to our speakers, some important housekeeping points you'll want to remember. Our press conference will be a total of 1 hour. It will be video recorded and made available tomorrow. The 4 speakers will be given a total of 5 minutes to make introductory remarks, and then we will bring in questions from journalists. Journalists, please type your questions by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, not the chat box on the side. Please provide your name and outlet and who your question is for. You can type your questions in English, French, or Spanish, and do so as the panelists are speaking. So you don't need to wait until the end. And once the panelists have finished speaking, I will read out your questions to the panelists. So with that, let me introduce our distinguished panel, all of whom are members of ICRICT. José Antonio Ocampo is the chair of ICRICT and a professor at Columbia University. He's a former Minister of Finance of Colombia and a former United Nations Undersecretary General for Economic and Social Affairs. Jayati Ghosh is Professor of Economics at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning, the School of Social Sciences in Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. Joseph E. Stiglitz is a Nobel laureate in economics and university professor at Columbia University, chief economist at the Roosevelt Institute, and a former senior vice president and chief economist of the World Bank. And our 4th speaker today is Thomas Piketty. He's professor of economics at the Paris School of Economics and a co-director of the World Inequality Lab. Welcome to you all. So with that, let's go to our first panelist, Professor Ocampo, or if you'll allow me, I will call you by your first name along with the other panelists. So José Antonio, what is ICRICT's view on tax reform as a response to the current crisis? And why have you published the report now? In other words, can't we simply kick the can down the road on tax reform to when this crisis is over? How urgent is it? Over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, thanks to Oxfam. I'm glad to be with all of the journalists present today, as well as the members of ICRICT that are in the panel and the supporting staff also with us. Let me say, as a precedent, that we come from a very unfair tax system worldwide, in which many corporations evade taxes through different mechanisms, or there is a significant erosion of taxes associated to practices of multinationals. And the second is, of course, that this crisis has generated a massive increase in the demand for public sector resources. Public sector resources that must be in particularly associated to the health crisis, of course, directly, but also to the many, many poor and vulnerable that are being affected, and the millions that are losing their jobs worldwide. So the two things make the case for a significant effort in this area. There is, of course, an ongoing discussion in the OECD inclusive framework that should take decisions this year, although there is now talk of delaying, which we do not support. Those negotiations have to do with the way digital payments are managed through the international tax system, which strong rules must be taken to avoid the tax evasion and tax avoidance. And also, as we put in this report, we support the idea of a 25% minimum corporate tax rate worldwide, which is, by the way, in our proposal when we launched this a few months ago, it was associated to, well, it was basically the average corporate tax rate of developed countries. So it should not be a major complaint, only, of course, for those firms that are avoiding or evading taxes. So that's one of the proposals that we're making here today in this report. Let me say also that we go back to the idea of a global asset registry as a mechanism to be able for tax authorities to know who are the beneficial owners of the different forms of wealth, and also support in that regard. And this is I think a basic proposal going forward to reduce or to increase the progressiveness of the tax system, that there should be a wealth tax. And for that, of course, we need to know where the wealth is located. And then some policies that may be adopted during the crisis, actually. The first one is actually a progressive digital service tax. The digital service firms are making lots of money during this crisis. Their services have been expanding worldwide. So there is a significant case to use them for that purpose. Another proposal is that some of the oligopolized corporations that are also making some extra profits as a result of the crisis should also contribute in an additional way to finance the crisis. And finally, that all firms that are subject to government benefits worldwide should be subject to the country-by-country reporting that was approved in the former phase of the OECD inclusive framework process in the BEPS convention that was signed in 2017. So this is the collection of taxes. I think all of them, make sense during the current crisis, and we look forward very much to the conclusion of the OECD inclusive framework negotiations, which are essential to improve the international tax system. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jose Antonio. That gives us a really clear idea of the various recommendations coming out of this report. Jayati, I want to go to you now to give us a little bit of the context in which we're dealing with right now. The impact of COVID-19 on developing countries is even more stark and is worryingly still unraveling. Many fear that this economic crisis will actually exacerbate existing inequalities. How valid are these concerns, and what can or should be done to mitigate against them? Over to you. And we'll have to unmute. Thank you.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you so much, Nadia. It's a great pleasure to be here in such distinguished company. And you're absolutely right. It's not that it will increase inequality, it already has increased inequality. Developing countries have been hugely affected by the economic impact even before the disease started spreading. And we are now just beginning to see the effects of the disease spread. So we actually have a perfect storm of economic disaster and health disaster in many, many countries, which will have massive implications. Now, I think one point that is often not realized is that also a major part of the inequality is that developing countries are unable to do the kinds of fiscal stimulus that we see across the advanced world. So many countries are actually engaging in more fiscal austerity even at this time. There have been very, very small fiscal stimuli, which have been counterbalanced by reductions in expenditure elsewhere. So in fact, the macroeconomic stimulus is sometimes negative in some of these countries. And this is amazing because, as you know, we have 70% informal workers, most of whom did not have any income over the last 3 months. Other than countries that enabled cash transfer, we have people actually on the verge of destitution and starvation. And so you definitely need huge increases in public expenditure, but because developing countries are worried about their external debt, they're worried about capital movements and capital flight, where if they spend too much and have large fiscal deficits, they are terrified of increasing their spending. We have to enable increased tax revenues. It's key, not just next year, but right now. And of course, that can only be done if we have something like all the measures that Jose Antonio mentioned in terms of a fair system of taxation. Basically, developing countries are in a position today where most of them cannot even spend on public health to get out of the health crisis. Forget about spending to prevent starvation and mass destitution and unemployment. So we are really in a situation where we have to have this increase in these tax revenues. And this is the beginning. We are in the middle of one particular crisis, but the existential threat of climate change is still upon us, and it is going to hit us very soon as well. So we really have to think of a multicolored global New Deal. It's not just green. Of course, it has to be green, but it also has to be purple. It has to emphasize the care economy. We now know how important healthcare is. We now know how important care in general is for all of our activities and for social survival. And it has to be red. It has to bring in greater equality. It has to talk about much greater egalitarianism and do that also through a progressive tax system and public spending that helps the poor. So I think all of these means that what the measures that we have suggested are not just very reasonable, they're extremely urgent. And you cannot actually think of a viable civilization globally until we start doing some of these measures immediately.
Thank you, Jayati. Thank you for the analysis and for also giving us some concrete ideas on how we can move forward in a positive way out of this dark time. Over to Joseph now. Joe, we've just heard about the devastating economic impacts of this crisis and thinking about inequality. Yet at the same time, we see the stock market now roaring back. The S&P 500 is back to pre-COVID-19 levels following a massive drop in March. So clearly not all businesses have been negatively impacted. Tech companies in particular are seeing shares reach record high levels. And at the same time, these are the very same companies that have been extremely undertaxed. Talk to us about the importance of making the corporate tax system more progressive generally, but also on increasing the corporate income tax rate on monopolies and oligopolies such as Google, Netflix, Amazon, Facebook, and others. Thanks. Joseph, you there?
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to share some of my thoughts on this issue. I think the previous speakers have made it very clear the magnitude of the revenue needs, the consequences of not raising the requisite revenue. In a way, the 2008 crisis made us aware of the tax avoidance activities of the multinationals. And there was a desperate need for money in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis. Well, this is 100 times worse. And so it is very clear we need revenue. And then you start thinking about the issues of how are the best ways of raising revenue. There are a couple basic principles in tax policy. You want those who are most able to pay. You want the taxes to be the least distortionary to create a level playing field. You want the tax system to be fair. It was already mentioned that before the pandemic, the system of taxation we had was not fair. It was distortionary. That the big multinationals had devised ways of avoiding taxes through tax competition, a race to the bottom, taking advantage of tax havens, and so forth. That distorted the economy. That meant the multinationals were getting away with paying lower taxes than small businesses, local businesses were. And that distorts the economy. It was also unfair. Among these inequities and distortions, the largest were associated with the internet companies. Apple and Google famously were paying a fraction of 1% of their revenues and taxes in Ireland. And when Ireland got exposed, Apple moved to the Channel Islands. So the point was they were committed to not paying their fair share of taxes. And that is what in some ways instigated this movement. Now, the pandemic, ironically, has helped the very companies that have been the tax avoiders. The internet companies are the big beneficiaries because they are the people who can continue to operate. They don't require face-to-face personal interaction. So they're the big beneficiaries of the pandemic. And so the pattern of a disproportionate share of the increase in GDP and revenues and profits going to these companies has been exacerbated. And so at the same time that we're seeing small businesses, local businesses having a very hard time, companies going to bankruptcy, these companies are doing very well. And part of their advantage is they're not paying taxes. They're not paying their fair share of taxes. So that makes the agenda of ICRICT the kind of agenda of having a minimum corporate income tax, of having taxation based on where the revenues are generated, more imperative than ever. I think that one of the aspects of these, because they're so profitable, you can actually, their marginal costs, their cost of operation are so low that a tax on their overall revenues is close to a profits tax, a pure profits tax, which is non-distortionary. So that's why the proposals as an interim measure until we work out a whole global system of just having a digital tax is one that had a lot of resonance before the pandemic, but now becomes an imperative. So the way I see it is that these are the companies that were not paying their fair share before. They are the companies that have been the beneficiaries of this. It is an unfair system that is distorting our economy, hurting job creation, hurting the recovery. And so it makes an awful lot of sense to have part of the tax reforms focus on these digital firms as part of the agenda of both the tax reform and raising the revenues that we're going to need to get out of this crisis.
Thank you for that, Joe. I'm sure there'll be many questions on some of those specifics that you've gone into, but for now, let's go over to Toma to speak a bit about the political viability of these ideas. Toma, it seems wealth taxation is making a comeback on political agendas, with a number of countries considering their introduction and talks in Europe about it. This message that the wealthy have to pay, at least in part, for the recovery, seems to be a message that is resonating strongly almost everywhere in the world. Maybe we needed a crisis like this to finally get acceptance of this idea. I'd love for you to help us look back to why it's been so difficult to tax wealth in the past, but also look to the present to talk about the obstacles we see to making this happen now. Over to you.
Right. Thank you for organizing this. Yeah, I think it's really important to realize that corporate taxation alone is not enough. It has to be integrated to a more comprehensive system of individual level taxation, and in particular individual level progressive taxation of income and wealth. And so corporate tax and a minimal corporate tax rate of 25% is good, is useful, only to the extent that it is incorporated to a global system with this global registry, so that governments can track income flows, asset ownership, because in the end, what matters is the final tax rate that is being paid by individual depending on their level of income, level of wealth. And so today, in most countries, labor income, including average labor income earners, are going to pay an effective tax rate that is a lot higher than 25%. And so, if the 25% corporate tax rate was a final tax rate, in the sense that corporations only pay this profit tax, and then somehow people who get the income don't really pay any other income tax or wealth tax, or very small income tax or wealth tax, that will not be sufficient. So that's why we need to think of this corporate tax system together with the rest of the tax system. I think the case for a wealth tax was already very strong before the pandemic, but I think it has become stronger. The debate, public discussion about wealth tax, as you were saying, was already changing a lot in the recent years. Look in the US political debate, in the Democratic primary, there was a lot of emphasis on the idea of creating a progressive wealth tax. And, it's very striking to see that it's actually a very popular idea in the electorate, not only in the Democratic electorate, but also in the Republican electorate. And, I think, Joe Biden will be well inspired to borrow some of the ideas that were pushed by Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders in this area. But it's not only in the US, like in Germany, it's very striking to see that the Social Democrats are now pushing the wealth tax as an important part of their platform, together with other political parties. And so the debate, in Germany, in the US, in Britain, in France, has been changing a lot. The bottom line is that at a time when we are going to have to pay for new investment in the hospital system, in the public services, and we are going to have to deal with a very large public debt, the view that nobody will have to pay for anything, which some politicians are trying to push, is simply not credible. I mean, in the short run, you can do away with debt, but at some point, what history tells us is that we'll have to do something with debt. And in historical circumstances with very large public debt, there are not so many ways to deal with that. You can have, primary surplus for decades if you want, but that's not very good if you think of investing in the future. You can have inflation, but that's not very good typically for the poor and the middle class. Or you can have, exceptional progressive wealth tax on the wealthy, and this actually worked pretty well after World War II. Germany and Japan in particular used very large exceptional wealth tax, up to over 50% of the very high financial wealth portfolio in Germany was taxed, so 50% of the stock, not of the income flow. And in Japan, it was up to 70, 80%. And it was not easy. It was a complicated political fight at the time. And I'm not saying things are going to happen this way again, but in the end, if you look retrospectively at this episode, this was a huge success, because this allowed these countries, to get rid very quickly of a very high level of public debt, over 200% of GDP in the end of the 1940s after World War II. And in the space of 5 to 10 years, they were able to basically get rid of that without the bad impact of inflation, which, of course, Germany had experienced in the 1920s, which is probably why they invented this better system in the 50s. So today we are in a different environment, but the common point and the important lesson from history is that we have an unknown crisis, which we've never seen something like that, with a complete lockdown and shutdown of the economy. We'll have to invent new solutions, and I think a more equitable tax system, will have to be part of the solution.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you for these insights. And a reminder to journalists to put their questions in the Q&A function by clicking on the icon at the bottom of your screen, rather than in the chat function on your side. So we'll turn swiftly now to questions that have already started to come in. Our first question is for Jayati from Aristegui Noticias in Mexico. Your report is proposing quite a revolution in the taxing of multinationals. How should it be done? Countries could do it nationally, but would a global organization be needed at the forefront of this process? Over to you.
Well, I mean, ideally, it should be organized internationally, but the beauty of this is that, in fact, it is something that would be administered within every country. Because if you have a minimum tax rate, then essentially once the principles are established that you would tax every multinational that is operating in your country on its sales and employment and some other, basically we take some criteria, and we have suggested sales and employment as two criteria that could be used. Then you would tax the multinationals' total global profits according to your share in their sales and employment. And that would be a way which would actually eliminate the need for them to move to do the base erosion and profit shifting, which is how they avoid taxes in most countries. Now, of course, the purpose would then of multinationals is to shift their activities to tax havens so that they avoid paying. But if enough countries do this according to these basic principles, then that incentive is lost. That is, if their major operations, their major markets are actually going to be taxing them anyway at this base rate or whatever other national rate they wish to set above that base rate, then there's no real incentive for you to try and move out your profits to other areas.
Thank you for that. Our second question is to Thomas. It comes from Pier Giorgio Sandri from La Vanguardia, Spain. He asks, is this time to raise taxes while many countries are reacting with tax deferrals and tax reliefs? Germany is even opting for a VAT cut at this time.
Yeah, but I think it's easier to pay for a VAT cut or a tax cut for the lower level of income and wages, or for the middle class. If you increase the tax on the big economic players. So at some point, it's going to be difficult just to reduce tax on everybody, increase spending and increase debt forever. At some point, you have to reorganize, the tax system, so as to be able to pay the bills.
And actually another question coming in from Morocco, developing countries in tax incentives and reduced tax rates are granted to attract foreign direct investment. Should they be considered as tax havens? This is a question coming to us from Morocco.
Is that for me, Nadia?
That's for Thomas.
Okay.
Well, please, Jayati, I will.
Please go ahead, Thomas, please.
Well, I think as Jayati was explaining a bit before, it's very difficult for developing countries and given the weakness of their tax administration and enforcement capabilities, to impose on their own a more equitable tax system on large corporations and high wealth taxpayers. But in the end, they are the main losers of illicit financial flows, tax competition, tax havens, and I think they will benefit, from a move by rich countries in the direction of more transparency and more tax progressivity. But to ensure that they will indeed benefit, it's also important to work closely on how we plan, to reallocate the missing profits from taxation. And this is an issue on which we've been working at ICRICT, in particular stressing that the way the OECD discussion so far has been referring to this issue, has been mostly a game of, taking the profits located in tax haven and reallocating them basically to rich countries. And if we want, poor and developing countries to get a fair share of the corporate profits that are currently allocated, in tax havens, we need to think about allocation rules that will take into account, for instance, not so much or not only the final sales to consumers, but the level of employment or level of resource mobilization and factor input for the production. So we have to be very careful in this discussion to make sure that the poor and developing countries will indeed benefit as much as they should from this tax reform.
Right. Now our next question
Can I make one comment?
Yes, please.
Yeah. First of all, the studies of these initiatives to recruit companies by giving tax preferences are that they don't work very effectively. That they are self-defeating, that what attracts investment are good infrastructure, well-educated workers. And so, first of all, it's not the best way for countries to try to attract businesses. Secondly, because of the race to the bottom, in the end, the only people who benefit are the companies. So it is even self-defeating.
And Joe, actually staying with you for a second, we have a question coming in from Dominic Coyle from the Irish Times asking, do you accept that Ireland's corporation tax rate of 12.5% has a purpose to attract multinational investment? Or is it your position that there's no basis for Ireland, even from a selfish viewpoint, to have such a low corporate tax rate?
Well, I think Ireland did get some advantage by having that lower tax rate at 12.5%. I didn't think they got much advantage of having zero, the close to zero that they gave to Apple. That was just a gift both of those are robbing their neighbors, their partners in Europe. And in that sense, I would say they're immoral, they're inequitable. And what Ireland got was less than what it cost the rest of Europe. It does emphasize the need for global cooperation. And it does emphasize the point that ICRICT has been emphasizing, the need for a global minimum tax. And the 25% number reflects the kind of tax rate that on average is paid by small businesses, those that cannot engage in this kind of tax avoidance activity. And finally, let me say that in terms of the first question of how do you get this imposed, if the United States and or Europe decided to go ahead on their own and impose this minimum tax, I think it would become the global standard. So the right thing is for Europe and the United States to go ahead and do it, and then all the other countries will come along.
Thanks for that. Our next question is to José Antonio. It comes to us from Eric Desrosiers from Le Devoir in Montreal. You seem to fear that governments are about to lower corporate taxes. What makes you think that?
Well, let me, I didn't make that point. Notice, and it's not in our document for sure. Now, there is a sense in many countries that one of the things that governments should do is actually to create new tax incentives in order to encourage the recovery. But actually, an op-ed that was published by Joe a few days ago, and also our document, makes clear that under the current conditions, general tax benefits will not work. Actually, if anything, they will just reduce the tax revenues, which is the last thing we want under the current circumstances. And the reason is that so far as there is no expectation of a recovery, there's not going to be additional investment. There might be specific benefits associated to breaking some of the major problems that we have seen. But in my view, it would be much better to give subsidies through government revenues. For example, for research and development in new vaccines. I think the current mechanisms in place, which is actually tax benefits on the one hand, and then intellectual property rights on the other, actually will probably be bad under the current circumstances. It would be much better to promote the research directly by the government on vaccine, and then when the vaccine comes, it should be of general access, period. Nothing subject to intellectual property rights.
Thank you. Our next question comes to us for Thomas. It is from Fabienne Grasser, a French journalist. Some countries like France, Poland, and Denmark are not giving bailouts to tax-dodging companies. However, the existing tax haven blacklists are very limited and do not include countries of the European Union like the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Ireland, the UK, or Malta. Isn't such an announcement to refuse bailouts only to satisfy the public? How would you respond to that?
I don't think so. I think there's you need to put limits on how much you mutualize losses and privatize profits, and we have to be very careful with that. And I think when some countries are going too much in the direction of tax competition and trying to attract the investment, as Joe was saying, it's not only that it's immoral, it's also that the benefits that a country like Ireland or Luxembourg is going to generate in extra welfare for their own citizens through this kind of policy, in some cases is going to be quite small as compared to the welfare loss imposed on others. And so I think it's not only immoral, it's also unsustainable, because in the long run, I don't think public opinion is going to continue to support globalization if people feel that globalization is working mostly to the benefit of the big players who always get mutualization of the loss and privatization of the profit. So at some point, if as a country wants to tax, say, corporate profits at 25% or 30%, and its neighbors tax them at 0% or 10%, the only solution, if there is no a cooperative solution like the one we are describing, is that at some point, the country who wants to tax at 30% will impose a tariff, on the other country in order to compensate for, the fact that not enough tax was paid on the other territory. So far, the countries have resisted going in this direction, and I don't, particularly want to push this solution, but, at some point, this is what we're going to get. That's for sure. If we don't have a cooperative solution, including within Europe.
Our next question is for Joe. It comes to us from Miguel Ramirez from Impestum, Mexico. What are the main obstacles to achieving this global minimum corporate tax rate? And how can a global deal on the minimum tax actually be achieved?
Well, you can say the obvious obstacle is political pressure from the companies who don't want to pay taxes. And so we're not surprised that there's some opposition. The problem is that the companies, the countries where some of the companies are located, namely the United States, has unfortunately sided with the companies. And, it's the sort of, you might say, the corruption of money in American politics that everybody knows about. And we're an exception in the degree in which money affects our politics, but it's true in other countries as well. So I think the answer is a very, very simple one. The kind of political reforms that are going on, where people are saying, you know, it's unacceptable to have regressive taxation with those at the top paying a lower tax rate than those below. That's just unacceptable. It's unacceptable for the corporations to get away with paying so low taxes. So I think that this really is very consistent with Thomas was saying, that the direction of politics is going to be, it is unacceptable for these companies who have the best ability to pay to get away with not paying. At the same time, those who are really suffering right now are asked to pay a higher percentage of their income. So I think that's going to be the answer eventually. And the question is, how much strife are we going to have before we get to that kind of an answer?
Thank you. Jayati, I know you'll have to leave us a few minutes early, so let me go to you. We have a question from Gulveen Ola from Economic Times, India. India has recently reduced corporate income tax to 22% to attract new investment, and it has introduced a new digital tax on overseas e-commerce transactions. What are your views on these moves?
Thank you, Nadia. The first move was extremely foolish, and exactly what Joel talked about happened in India, which is that there was a very, very dramatic reduction in the tax rate. There was no new investment as a result. The exchequer lost a very significant amount, about 1% of GDP, and it therefore had a larger fiscal deficit than they anticipated, and therefore they had to cut down on other expenditures in that. So it was completely counterproductive, the reduction in the tax rate. Essentially, investors are not really looking at that. They're looking at the market, and they're looking at profitability of new investment. And in a slowing down economy, which it was already before the pandemic, there was no incentive to invest more. So that was a completely useless attempt, which didn't work. The other is a very tentative and minor move to try and tax digital companies, which is certainly valid in the current situation, because we know, as was mentioned earlier by Joe and by Jose Antonio, that digital companies are raking it in even during the pandemic. And e-commerce companies in particular are major beneficiaries of this. They've actually expanded their revenues like anything. So there is an attempt to at least bring about some equity in terms of the rates of taxation of multinational companies vis-a-vis the domestic companies. But it's a very, very minor attempt, and a much more effective way would be precisely what ICRICT is suggesting, to actually have a global unitary taxation based on a minimum tax rate globally that would enable all of us developing countries to benefit.
Jayati, let me just stay with you for a second, and hopefully we have a couple more minutes with you. We have a question coming in from Belén Saldivar from El Economista in Mexico. And they ask, what is the risk for developing countries to engage on austerity plans again? You spoke a little bit about this, if you can just elaborate a bit more.
Well, the risk is, it's horrendous. The implications are beyond description. They are actually going to push developing economies into an even deeper economic hole. This is the last time at all to be thinking of fiscal austerity. Yet when countries practice this, they're adding to the economic decline, they're furthering the negative multiplier effects. And it's the classic paradox of thrift at the government level. So actually the practice of austerity, which is occurring in Mexico, which is occurring in India, which is occurring in a bunch of other developing countries, is the worst possible policy to be chosen at this time. And it will have terrible impacts, not just on the current situation and on the level of economic activity, on the unemployment, on the collapse in employment opportunities and livelihoods, and in fact the open destitution, but it will have terrible impacts on the future. Because as these economies contract, you're also going to get a terrible impact in terms of dynamic economies of scale. You're going to lose the potential for growth as well. So I think it's impossible to think of a more disastrous or macroeconomically stupid strategy at the moment.
Thank you.
Can I say that I entirely support Jayati's point of view. I think that Mexico is actually one of the worst cases in Latin America in the management of the current crisis. The decision to maintain an austerity policy under these conditions is only matched, in my view, by the credit rating agencies that are downgrading countries because they're not doing austerity under the circumstances, and they're going to have a high level of debt, public sector debt after the crisis, which is what all countries are going to have in the world after this crisis. So it's no argument for austerity under the current circumstances. Rather, you need more spending, again, particularly for the poor or vulnerable, which in most Latin American countries are informal workers. In India is even more so. So that they are left with no income under the current circumstances. So they do need a significant amount of support. And then you may also want to support, wage, employment, formal employment through some form of wage subsidy, which is a policy that several European countries have adopted. So this is not time for austerity. It's actually time to support all of this, plus health spending, of course.
Thank you, Jose Antonio. And moving now to Brazil, we've got several questions coming in from Brazil, actually. And the first one is for Thomas. He says, the economic situation, this is from Jamil from UOL. He asked, the economic situation in Brazil is dire and inequality is a major issue. Thomas, how can we avoid a further concentration of wealth in Brazil as a result of the current crisis?
Well, if you look at it from an historical perspective, Brazil belongs to this set of countries when there was never really an historical transition toward the reduction of inequality. In the 20th century, many countries went through an historical stage of large reduction of inequality, in particular through progressive taxation. Now in Brazil, this never really happened, and historically, the level of inequality has remained very high, and even under the Lula and Workers' Party government, what we found at the World Inequality Lab is that they were able to improve a little bit the situation of the bottom 50% through Bolsa Familia, the increase in the minimum wage, but this was mostly at the expense of the next 40% in the distribution rather than the top 10% or the top 1% who remained in terms of share in total income and wealth at an extremely high level in Brazil. And there was never the Lula government and workers' parties were never really able to implement a tax reform, especially at the top of the distribution, that would compress the gaps to a more reasonable level. It's not that they didn't want to, but the political system also in Brazil, the electoral system in particular, makes, it's a very strange situation. You can have 60% of the vote at the presidential election, which Lula did a couple of times, but still you don't have an absolute majority in parliament, which, in many countries with other electoral system, you would have. And so how do you change this? This is complicated, but the historical experience in many countries is that if you don't change the political and electoral system itself, it's difficult to get redistribution going. So, in the United States, until the constitutional change of 1913, it was impossible to have an income tax at the federal level. And then just after, so it was a complicated process. It took several decades to adopt this. But then right after it was adopted, in the interwar period, progressive taxation in the US at the federal level, reached levels that have been, unheard of historically. So the good news is that things can change, and in history, countries are not bound to be unequal forever. In my work, I have seen, many examples of countries that were very unequal move to more equal. But it takes very often not only a change in economic policy, but also change in the political structure and the political institution in effect of the country.
Thank you, Toma. We've got questions coming in for Joe, and they're both related to digital taxation. The first one is from Daniela Chiaretti from Valor in Brazil. Joseph, you were mentioning progressive digital services taxes. What do you mean by progressive, and how would that work? Should it be unilateral or global? And a second question, how would you deal with the threats of retaliation of the United States when a country does consider digital taxes? Because this is not only an economic issue, it is also a political one. Over to you, Joe.
Oh, thank you. First of all, almost by their nature, whatever digital tax is progressive. And all I meant by progressive would be that you would not be taxing small companies. You want to encourage the development of the digital sector in Brazil and in other countries. What we're talking about are the mega digital companies, the multinationals that we're focusing on. And because they have so much profits and so much revenue, they are an important source for avoiding the kind of austerity that Jayati talked about and Jose Antonio. I mean, I let me put my voice in there very strongly that this is not the time for austerity. You know, if you want to convert, remember the Great Depression lasted 10 years from the collapse of the stock market in 29 until the beginning of World War II. And part of the reason was that after that Hoover had austerity, then we had the New Deal, but then in 1936-37, there was a resurgence of austerity and we went back into recession. So if you want to have a 10-year recovery, go ahead and have austerity. But if you want a quick recovery, austerity is not the way. The issue of retaliation in today's world is a difficult problem. My own feeling is that probably in November, there will be a new administration in Washington that will believe in a rules-based international system. And part of that rules-based international system is going to be tax cooperation. You can't have a world where you retaliate whenever a country does something you don't like. In particular, what we're talking about here is an international framework where we're imposing taxes where the economic activity occurs. And part of what we're talking about in the digital tax is the economic activity of it's only be imposed, for instance, on goods bought through Amazon or some other digital company in Brazil, advertising that is paid for by companies in Brazil. There's an important part of the activity occurring in Brazil. It's not like Brazil is taxing activity that has nothing to do with Brazil. We should be moving towards an international framework. And that's what ICRICT has been advocating since its founding. But in the meanwhile, while we're trying to struggle to get the right framework, we cannot not tax these companies that are making such revenues today. It is distorting the market. It is hurting local companies, and something has to be done now.
Thank you, Joe. I know we're approaching the hour, but I'm going to try and squeeze in 3 more questions. We have one for Jose Antonio. It comes to us from Alex Parker from Law 360. Do you believe that the OECD's BEPS 2.0 project can address some of these issues we've been talking about today?
Well, actually, we have a clear position in ICRICT, which is that this should be moved, this issue of supporting international tax cooperation should be done by the United Nations, not by OECD. And actually, another point that I will make is actually that the OECD reports are less good on these issues, on the issues of tax avoidance and tax evasion, than those by the International Monetary Fund, which has pointed out that some of the great losers from the lack of international tax corporations are actually the developing countries, and they estimate much higher losses worldwide and much higher losses for developing countries. I think one of the basic points in that regard, and this is a José, not in substantial detail, is that the technical staff of OECD is from developed countries. They don't have a technical staff from developing countries. And I think coming from a developing country, I think the perspective of having grown up in a developing country makes you think slightly different. There are, of course, good people like Joe and Thomas who can also think about developing countries in the right way, but not all developed country economies do. And I think, generally speaking, therefore, we have been for this issue to be done by the United Nations, which actually has a tax committee, which could be becoming intergovernmental. That was actually the proposal that developing countries, through the group of 77 presented in the Addis Ababa Financing for Development Conference 5 years ago, which was vetoed at the time by the United States and the UK. But that's probably the proposal, to have an intergovernmental tax cooperation organ in the United Nations, and then an office that technically supports expanded intergovernmental tax cooperation.
Thank you.
Just
Very
to
clear.
add, let me add to this that in my view there are really two problems with the OECD approach. The first problem is
let me just ask you another question, and then you can answer both together. So this next question is from Kemal Pekin with Bloomberg. And the question is, will the EU manage to coordinate a single tax policy in the near term? Is this crucial to the EU's future? So you can build off of Jose Antonio and go to that question.
So let me come to the EU in 1 second, but let me say, I think the problem with the OECD is first that it is very much a rich country perspective, and that's exactly what José Antonio was saying. So basically they are very good at trying to find ways to get the tax haven corporate base back to the rich country tax administration, but the poor country's perspective is too much absent from the discussion. And the other big limitation with the OECD perspective on tax reform is that it looks really only at corporate taxation, strictly speaking, and not so much at the bigger picture in terms of progressive taxation of income and wealth. And I think it's really critical to integrate corporate taxation within this broader picture of what a fair tax system should look like. Now, for the European Union, my own view is that it's going to be very difficult for the European Union to do anything with 27 countries all together, and that this will come from a smaller group of countries. And I think at some point, as I was saying earlier, probably some smaller group of countries will have to put some real sanctions on non-cooperative countries, which hopefully will then push them to cooperate. And so, hopefully, we will move very quickly to a situation with 27 countries having a common corporate tax, etc. But I don't think this is going to happen spontaneously. I think, unfortunately, probably this has to happen if a smaller group of countries, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, whatever set of countries decides to move ahead, and in the end forces other countries to join. Otherwise, they will face economic sanctions, and they will not be able to benefit from economic integration forever if they don't cooperate in terms of taxation. Now, that being said, everything can happen with the European Union. As you've seen recently, we are about possibly to decide through the unanimity rule to have common public debt without knowing in advance which common tax will be able to reimburse this public debt, and leaving it for the unanimity rule to decide 10 years from now what kind of common tax will reimburse for it. So, we have a lot of imagination in terms of constructing a very unlikely political structure. And, we have to be modest. We've never seen a political construction like this in the past. So, I gave you my opinion, but, I don't know exactly what's going to happen.
Thank you. Our final question actually is directed at both Jose Antonio and Thomas, and it comes to us from Marie Vianot. She's an economic journalist at France Culture. Who is going to pay for the whatever it costs? You did not mention the possibility of canceling the debt held by central banks. What do you think of this proposal made by some economists? Or do you think that the answer is mainly on fairer and new taxation? Thank you. I'll leave it to either of you or both of you to answer, and then we'll close out the session.
Well, during this crisis, I have been in favor of measures which are more ambitious than the ones that have been adopted to support, to write off or postpone payments of debt of the low-income countries. There is only a minimum decision that was adopted by the G20 for basically to postpone payments for this year. But it should be at least one more year and some actually explicit debt relief, that is debt reduction. For emerging economies, it depends heavily on the economy, because first of all, there are some that do require a significant tax restructuring. In Latin America, for example, it's quite clear that Argentina and Ecuador require a major debt restructuring. In contrast to that, there are countries that have been able to access private capital markets, which have actually come back. Bond financing for emerging economies is returning. And some countries, including my own Colombia, but also Mexico, Chile, Peru, Brazil, actually, have been able to access that market. Therefore, for those, I think what we need is better accessing the private markets, plus a significant increase in financing by multilateral development banks, which is something that is not coming yet. That was the way the issue was managed during the 2008-2009 crisis, and it worked. And then perhaps have an intermediate solution, which I have been supporting, which is my colleague Patrick Bolton, the lawyer Lee Buchheit, and others, which is a voluntary mechanism for basically rescheduling debt, postponing debt payments during the crisis through a voluntary mechanism that will be supervised by a multilateral development bank. So emerging economy is a more heterogeneous world, but for the time being, low-income countries should be subject to much more substantial debt relief.
Let me answer for the case of rich countries and Europe in particular. So as of today, the European central banks owns about 20 to 25% of the total public debt of the eurozone, and in the US it's a comparable proportion. And I think we could very well cancel this part of the public debt. Well, in effect, it's already canceled in the sense that we could decide, not to include it anymore when we compute public debt over GDP, because unless the central bank, decides to sell all this public debt securities, next week, which I don't think they will do. The question is, can we, in legal terms, we will need to change the rules of the central bank just to ensure that they commit never to sell these securities, which in effect will amount to cancelling the debt. So we are almost there, and I think we could go further in this direction. I am very much in favor of the European Central Bank and the Federal Reserve in the US, taking on its balance sheet a bigger share of the public debt and allowing the government to invest more, in health, education, green technologies. Now, at some point, as we keep doing it more and more, we should, if you do real recovery, you create, new spending and, create new jobs in thermal renovation of buildings or hospitals and new wages, and you have real recovery. This should, in the end, push inflation toward 2, 3, 4%, which I think will be better than 0% or 1%. But then at this stage, of course, we'll have to stop. And then, progressive taxation of wealth and, exception, will be useful if we want to further reduce the public debt. So we have to use these different tools together. We don't want just one or the other. We have to use European, central banks for what they can give, the fiscal system for what they can give, and there's not one magic bullet that will do the trick entirely.
Thank you for that. And I know we have so many questions coming in that we weren't able to get to, unfortunately. I'm afraid that's all we'll have time for today. But for any further questions or interviews, please do contact Lamia Walalou with ICRICT or Annie Theriot with Oxfam. Both contacts should be available in the materials you've received. A huge thank you to our panelists for their time today and insights around this report, which, as I mentioned, is available now to the public and on ICRICT's website. And a reminder that the recording of this press conference will be available tomorrow. Thank you again, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day or evening. Bye.
Thank you.
Well,
Bye.
let me thank Oxfam in particular again, to you, Nadia, to Raina, to Susana, and of course, also to Tommaso and Lamia, which worked with us in ICRICT, which coordinated the whole conference with you. Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you, Jose Antonio. It was a pleasure and a privilege. Thank you.
Thank you.